Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary educational program organized in a set of thematic courses. I'm Ann Stephenson, Director of Professional Development on the Lifelong Learning team. Thank you for joining our program, Transforming the Future of Climate. This program is part of our theme, Future Forward Research, which will showcase Duke research initiatives that emphasize collaboration across campus and explore how Duke is positioning itself as a leader in innovative solutions for some of the most pressing issues of our time. Today's program is the third session in the Future Forward Research series, focusing on Duke's transformative research and innovative solutions for a sustainable future to address environmental challenges. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Tighe. Dr. Tighe is an associate professor of medicine and environmental science and policy at Duke University and serves as vice chief for research in the Division of Pulmonary, Allergy, and Critical Care. A physician scientist, his research focuses on the health impacts of air pollution, lung disease susceptibility, and pulmonary fibrosis. He also leads a Duke School of Medicine strategic planning effort on climate and health research, bringing together faculty and trainees to advance multidisciplinary, community-oriented solutions. As a clinician, he cares for patients with pulmonary fibrosis at the Duke Durham VA Medical Center. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Dr. Tighe.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And let me pull up my slides here. So it's my pleasure to be here today and to have a chance to talk to you all about some of the work that's being done on campus that relates to climate and specifically its impacts on health. And so I wanted to just talk through some of the objectives that we'd have for the talk that I'm going to give today, kind of talking about how does climate impact health and trying to be somewhat specific about sort of the health impacts, of which there are many, and trying to think about it through some of the work that we do that's focused around health effects of air pollutants and thinking specifically about how that impacts individuals with lung disease. And then talk a little bit about what Duke is focused on, and how Duke is, like many other institutions, is trying to focus on what are these impacts and how do we meet the need to try to look forward in addressing them. So I know I had a nice introduction, but I do add a little bit of sort of where do I come from this and how did I get involved in any of this activity. So I'm a physician and a scientist, and I'd like to say that, I credit all of you all because Duke was the place that allowed me coming from from medical school and then after residency training to really have time to develop an interest and the opportunity to be involved in scientific investigation that really helps me to try to help take better care of the people that I take care of. And that wouldn't have been possible without the institution and the way that the institution is focused on taking people like myself who had really no science background in the beginning and really developing them into individuals that have curiosity and are really trying to improve the world around us. So I'm an associate professor of medicine, and I also work in the Nicholas School of the Environment. And I'm the vice chief for research for the Division of Pulmonary, Allergy, and Critical Care. I have this wacky group of people that spend time in the lab that do most of the work, and most of our work is really interested, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about this, of how do we identify the most vulnerable to adverse health effects of air pollutants, and how could that lead to targeted strategies for those individuals to try to mitigate the health effects. But about a year ago, I was asked by Dean Mary Klotman of the School of Medicine to lead a strategic planning effort that was focused on our knowledge at the time of the increasing concern about health impacts that relate to how our climate is changing, and trying to make sure that we were identifying those effects as well as working towards thinking about solutions to help protect individuals who are most at risk, as well as to think of how we can contribute to the knowledge of what's going on in the space and thinking about innovative solutions. And so that has been a process that I've been leading for the past year. So from the standpoint of the first part of my talk, as a physician, I'm always grounded in the people that I meet and the people that I take care of. And they really inform the direction of what I do research wise and how I focus. So I principally work clinically with veterans at the Durham VA Medical Center. And my interest is in clinically is in people who have pulmonary fibrosis, which is a progressive scarring disorder in the lung that ultimately, in many cases, takes people's lives. And so this has been a passion of mine, and it does relate to some of the work that we do with air pollution. So this was one of my clinic patients. He is a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran. He came to clinic to see me for increased shortness of breath. He has a medical history of a disorder where individuals have both chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and fibrosis at the same time, and we call that combined pulmonary fibrosis and emphysema. He was somebody that required oxygen to function during the course of his day. Also had other medical problems, including things like diabetes, heart disease, and was a prior smoker. So many veterans, like the passion that they have in life, and actually the thing that I probably spend most of my clinic time talking about is how they love to mow their grass. Um, and the contraptions that people make, even with chronic lung disease, where they're very short of breath at times, to be able to continue to mow their grass. And so he came because he noticed that his shortness of breath had worsened as he was mowing his grass. And this was in the summer of 2023 in Durham, North Carolina. And this is an image of that of what he was dealing with at that time. And I show sort of what was it outside when he was mowing, and you can notice that there's a haziness in the air that exists to the point that this was not late in the day. This was early in the morning, and you can see that you can't quite see the sun, and you can see sort of the haziness across the spectrum. And this is downtown Raleigh, which was similarly experiencing that as well. And when you look, there are ways that we report this. So this is poor air quality. And so there are what are called air quality indexes. And what they're designed to do is to help identify when the air quality is poor in regions. And this was put out by the Department of Environmental Quality at the in from North Carolina. But a lot of these maps are actually generated by federal government services, including the Environmental Protection Agency. And what they're designed to do is to help to try to inform the public of when there are days where the air quality is not very good. So red and purple are bad, orange is also bad. And you can see that in this area, particularly the area of Durham, that we had a very unhealthy air quality day. So suggesting that there was high levels of air pollution. So why was that happening? Because that's not a normal thing all the time that we see in North Carolina. Well, it turns out that this is a thing that relates to what we're going to talk about in terms of climate change, because this was a function of the Canadian wildfires. And I know that they got a lot of press in the lay press in 2023, but large swaths of upper parts of Canada started to have wildfires due to extreme drought and extreme temperatures. And those fires raged largely uncontrolled for most of the summer. In fact, in many cases, they were so hot that even through the winter, the fires maintained themselves and actually came back the next year. So even though we used to think of the fire season as really being just one season, it's now becoming much more continual sort of thing. But those fires and the smoke that relates to them don't stay in one place. And so, as you can see here, this is looking at the wildfire smoke forecast from that time of the range. And there are areas not near the fires, but distant to the fires, and has to do with weather patterns and how that smoke is transmitted. And so we're ending up with those in other locations. And in fact, the smoke was so bad and so significant and so severe that it actually ended up crossing the Atlantic Ocean and ending up in Spain and Portugal as well. So this is these kind of large events that occur as we're dealing with this. And in fact, there are places around the world that are dealing with the same sort of forest fires. So this is an image from Singapore, which deals perpetually with wildfires that occur in Malaysia and then cause poor air quality in those regions. So it's hard to it makes us understand that these events are not singly located to one particular area, but are things that we're all experiencing across the globe. And so what happened to Mr. M? So he did develop a cough. Um, he was given an inhaler, and the inhaler did provide some relief in his cough. He had to increase his oxygen use. Um, and when he did that, he didn't really notice much of a difference in his dyspnea. And with some increased inhaler use, his symptoms improved over the next 3 weeks. So, luckily, a good outcome, meaning that it wasn't a long term worsening of his health. But he asked if his exacerbation was related to his smoking exposure and if there was anything should do in the future. And I find that in my own clinic, I'm getting a lot more of those questions now than I used to, as people are starting to understand that their environment does impact their health and how changes in the environment can impact that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is an example of how climate change is not just sort of a um, easy to sort of think of it as sort of like a non-specific thing that sort of happens in some place, and that's really not happening to me. These are personal things that are happening to us as individuals, and they're impacting the health of ourselves, but also the health of our communities. And really, at the end of the day, this is a generational challenge, because even with efforts, this is going to continue, and so we're going to have to find ways to learn to become more resilient and to adapt to the changes that are occurring in our climate, and how that impacts us as individuals. And so one of the most obvious ways to think, to sort of highlight this is to think about temperature. And temperature and extreme temperatures are the things that we're appreciating the most. Um, Regardless of your opinion of sort of and I know this gets controversial, of sort of the sources of climate change and how that's occurring, I think it's hard. The data would tell us that regardless of that, that the planet is warming, and that it's warming at an exponential rate. So if you look at over time, this is air temperature on the left-hand side. As we go across time, there's a significant increase in the temperature, in the air temperature from our planet. And in the past year, we were above the 1.5 degree C change in temperature. The other piece is that our oceans are warming, and I'm sure that many of you have heard in the press about the increase in ocean temperatures. And actually, this is really much more significant than even the air temperatures. A lot of those of us that pay attention to sort of spaghetti plots of data over time, and particularly temperature data, is that they shouldn't make these kind of dramatic shifts. So there is something that's going on, and the oceans are actually a particular source of how we moderate our climate. So as the oceans warm and we're losing a sink for where temperature goes, it's highly likely that the temperature increases will increase after that. So this is an area of significant concern. And so we talked about how these higher heats actually drive severe weather events. And I talked about some of the smoke related issues, but it turns out that it's also other weather related issues. So for those of you that live in the Southeast, Hurricane Helene went from being, if you remember, not much of anything that we were worried about at all, to all of a sudden being this large category 4 hurricane that hit and then landed in an area that was particularly vulnerable to the extreme amounts of water that occurred, which in my state left with tremendous devastation that is still ongoing, and still being addressed, and probably will be for many years to come, where small valleys got inundated with large amounts of water and the flooding damage that occurred. And this is even occurring for people who live near the coast, watching the sea level rise, and clearly can showing how sea level rise is increasing in places like North Carolina, and the impacts that has, not only the people that live really close to the water, but on the communities that are there, and the impacts to those communities, and how that also impacts the things that are going on with them. So, and these events have a tremendous cost, and that cost, of course, is not borne. equally across the United States, as an example. And we can see that particularly in the Southeast, the cost of these damages from these large weather events is really substantial and is unfortunately borne the worst by those who have the least income to respond. And so this is looking at how much of your income you're having to spend, um, based on being poorer or richer in terms of responding to these climate related events that are happening. But beyond that as well, these also end up with human health impacts. And so this was a graphic that was generated by the CDC, and I think is really helpful because it tries to integrate some of the complexity that goes on here. And I'm going to talk about a specific aspect in a second. But in the center circle, where you're focused on rising temperatures, more extreme weather, and sea level rise, and sort of the immediate impacts of that from things like extreme heat, severe weather, air pollution, changes in vector, meaning infectious burdens, increasing allergen and water quality impacts, to the outer things, the things that relate to heat related illnesses and death, injuries and fatalities, malnutrition and diarrheal disease, lots of different types of infections. And as we think about in air pollution, about the effects of on health related to that. And so I've talked in a granular sense, and I think, in some cases, I think this graphic is really helpful, but in other ways, it's also really hard to take in because it feels like it's just about everything, and that can make it challenging to think about, really what are climate impacts and how does that affect individuals, and how do we make this a story that talks about sort of what are the specifics that affect an individual. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the relationships that we find between climate change and the effects on air pollution and air pollution impacts. So air pollution, as many of you know, is a product sort of really our industrial life. Like we increase air pollution as it allows us to do the many things that we enjoy doing in our lives, both from driving cars, from having industrial manufacturing that generate the products that we use in our lives, to flying airplanes, and then all of those are sources of combustion that lead to increases in air pollutants. And that's has benefits to society because we've been able to develop, we've been able to extend our lifespans, we've been able to live in a world that has a lot more interconnection, et cetera. So there's many benefits, but like most things in life, there are also disadvantages as well. And so, one of the seminal events that led to our understanding of the health effects from air pollution is really is the Great Smog Event of London. This was in 1952. It was a particular day where a series of factors contributed. One, high levels of burning of coal for energy, as well as automobile traffic, a lot of which was diesel, and a weather pattern that held that smog in the London area for a prolonged period of time. And this was one of the seminal events of the environmental health movement, and it was based largely on this data here. And this is a bit of a complicated figure, so I want to try to break it down. Going up this axis are increasing number of deaths, and then the other axis is also showing the concentration of various pollutants. So as this rises for deaths, you can also see the rise in the pollutants that were associated with this. And so this event had what they noticed was during this event that there was an increase in mortality that occurred. And in fact, what they observed here was also that spike, even after it went back down as as the conditions changed, that there was still elevated mortality in this single event. So the single air pollution event that caused almost attributed to about 12,000 deaths that occurred over a period of time. And so a significant event that occurred. But it turned out at the time, if you look back for images from New York in the 1970s, that the US had a similar problem in terms of the amount of smog and pollution in environments. And in fact, this ultimately led to what established the Environmental Protection Agency, and particularly the Clean Air Act. And that led to a focus on some of these air pollutants, including particulate matter And some of the gas pollutants, which include carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and ozone, which is one of the pollutants that we focus on in the lab. And then ultimately, this led to setting national ambient air quality standards, which has significantly reduced the pollution. And for those that have been to New York or have been to certain cities, you don't see this kind of level of pollution at the present time anymore. And ultimately, when you sort of look at the impacts that these things have, and even though these seem abstract, I would challenge anybody that doesn't think that the impact here has been dramatic. So when they did a cost benefit analysis from 1970 to 1990, it prevented 205,000 premature deaths with an economic benefit of $50 trillion versus $500 billion that was required for implementation. So if I was an investor and that's my return on investment, I would be really quite happy with that. And they've done some edits of that more recently, looking at sort of reductions in premature deaths, reductions in asthma exacerbations, of which I take care of, and the ultimate health savings. And it turns out that even with this reduced level, that we're still having adverse health effects that relate to air pollutants. And this is some work that was published now several years ago that was looking at mortality that relates to air pollution in an elderly population in the United States. And what they observed was that there were still health effects and still adverse mortality even below those current standards. And I think what we're going to appreciate in the context of air pollution and a changing climate, particularly one that's warming, is that those warming trends are going to increase the number of these wildfire events that are going to worsen air quality. And ultimately, in many circumstances, heat actually facilitates chemical reactions that make these pollutants more present in our environment. And so we're getting to a point where it may be hard to completely regulate for all of these events, and or the economic consequences of trying to completely regulate this may be really too significant to be viable. And we're also getting to this point, as I mentioned, where we're going from these episodes where we had prior to the Clean Air Act to this is images now from New York during these Canadian wildfires, where it may be challenging, particularly for these acute events, to really regulate those. And that's still associated with adverse health outcomes. So this is looking at the emergency room visits. You can see this spike in the emergency room visits from areas in New York for people with asthma exacerbations and respiratory complaints that relate to the where the particulate matter was higher. So we take this as an opportunity in the lab to really try to understand this and really try to focus on thinking through what are these links. And I think this in a changing climate, one of the things that we're working on is thinking about how do we meet this need. Certainly an important need for trying to limit sources of air pollution and as much as we can to become more efficient so that we don't have high levels, but I think the reality tells us also that it has to be a dual-faced approach, right? So you have to also think about who are the most vulnerable and how do we intervene in those individuals. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about these environmental exposures and how they lead to human health impacts, and what are the features that lead to some increased susceptibility, and can that ultimately inform us with things? So we think about sort of our host genetics, sort of what is our makeup genetically, and does that genetic makeup make us more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution and how that might lead to adverse health effects? We also have started to think a lot about sort of factors of an individual and what we all bring to the table, particularly as we get older. Things like other health problems that might influence those effects. Things like prior lung infections. So we have an active project that's looking at people after they've had COVID and whether that makes them more susceptible going forward to air pollution. People who have lung disease, we know that certain types of lung disease are more susceptible, and how that might affect sort of our normal way that our immune system would protect us, which does become more defective. And as we sort of learn about these things, we can start to think about how do we not approach a one size fits all strategy for everybody, but how do we think about sort of targeted interventions for individuals? So as we're knowing that things and sources are going to increase in a changing climate, how can we start to address some of these specific factors that might be making more people more vulnerable, and therefore being able to focus our interventions in a more cost-effective way on the individuals who are most vulnerable? And so that's really the hope for one of our labs. But so let me transition now a little bit to talk about what's Duke's doing more globally to address some of the issues that have been raised around climate health. So, as many of you might know or not, Duke made a climate commitment. It says about 2 or 3 years ago at this point, and that was a whole of campus effort, a university wide impact oriented initiative to address the climate crisis by creating sustainable and equitable solutions that place society on the path toward a resilient, flourishing, carbon neutral world. And so that's the overall mission of the climate commitment. And it focuses on 5 pillars that relate to education, research, sustainable operations, external engagement, and community partners. Well, as one can imagine, so I'm based in the health system and in the School of Medicine, and we're a big part of campus, but we also have our own idiosyncrasies. And so there was a need also to really focus on this from the standpoint of health and the health system. And the health system has focused on aspects of education, sustainability, and research. And I'm happy to talk about any of them, even if it's at a later time. But most of what I've focused on is research. And there was very clearly when I started this a lot of enthusiasm on campus and active groups that are really engaged and involved on campus, including the School of Nursing that is interested in sort of global education and outreach into communities, obstetrics and gynecology, so interested in sort of how climate is impacting reproductive health and a lot of really important things about particularly maternal health and maternal fetal health that relate to heat and its impacts. Work in population health sciences, which is really focused on trying to understand how do we develop intervention strategies that are focused around climate that can be impactful for communities and using data as a way to get to that information. The Global Health Institute has recently initiated a climate change and global health initiative that's really focused on thinking about the global impacts of climate change on health, and some exciting work that they're doing in that setting. And then this is a part of the recent campaign that is active. And one of the campaign pillars is a focus on climate. And so I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and engagement on campus and efforts to try to sort of focus that effort to really be impactful. And so one of the things that I've been working on was a strategic plan that was developed in the School of Medicine, but was designed to think about efforts across campus of how do we really leverage the sort of amazing potential and activity of the university to be impactful to communities. And this is really designed around thinking about how do we develop um, research areas of expertise that are really informed by communities, right? So that the we are doing an active part of reaching out to communities and engaging with communities that are particular risk, finding out the things that they are noticing and the things that are important to them, and trying to leverage the amazing expertise that exists on campus to really help those communities address those concerns that lead to either targeted things that can become interventions or strategies, or can lead to data that informs policy and interventions that occur at either state or national or international levels. And so when we did this landscaping of the campus, what was very clear is that one of the strengths of the university was the ability to take research that goes all the way from sort of basic discovery of what's going on with things, all the way out to how do we interact with communities and come up with plans that are community informed and community derived. And so trying to leverage across that spectrum and thinking about how do we do that. And that came up with these 4 pillar areas that we've been working to focus on. Basic biology and physiology of heat. How does heat affect the human body and how does it affect the things that we're exposed to? And what are the implications for that? Understanding that we also need to understand what the data is telling us. There's large amounts of data out there about human health. There's large amounts of data about various impacts of climate. But linking those really requires some effort to try to really make this something that's robust and starts to provide us information in real time to identify individuals who are most at risk, and then think about how would we get the appropriate resources and strategy to get to them to help mitigate those effects. But the next one was climate and health observatories. This is an understanding that climate is experienced in many places in terms of health, with specific things that happen that are generalizable across the globe, but also understanding that some of the effects are actually going to be quite local, and really needing to try to leverage the expertise that Duke has globally and the global partnerships that already exist and are well formed as a way to inform what's happening in terms of climate and health across the globe. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, thinking about how does this lead to solutions that are oriented towards the community and really lead them to become more resilient in the face of a changing climate, and how can we improve health, not only for communities, but also for individuals. And at the end of this, I want to say this because I think it is important to say is that I have given this talk a lot of times, and then people come away really depressed and like really, concerned about what's going on and feeling like there's nothing that can be done. And I actually would say that one of the things that I've taken away from the last year of being engaged across campus, and talking to faculty and talking to communities and talking to leadership, is really a sense of enthusiasm and hope for the potential of really doing informative work here and really making us sort of think in a way that we haven't done before about how our various aspects of research align with issues that are really important to individuals that we care about, and how we can align those strategies and align those interventions across. And that's really the focus of what work that we're working on now on campus, to really address those and then develop the teams that are required that are multidisciplinary. And there's a lot of excitement around that and the potential that that has. And so I really want to leave this with this as an opportunity, and an opportunity to really do something, to really impact on communities and the individuals that we take care of, but also to reinvigorate the idea of multidisciplinary research that really is a hallmark of what Duke stands for as an institution, and the place that got me excited in doing research in the first place. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions at this point. And I'd be really interested to hear sort of your thoughts and what you might think about, in terms of what I talked about, or anything that would help clarify any questions.
In your research on air pollution, you've identified the most vulnerable population. And can you expand upon how you've done that and what kind of things you're recommending?
Yeah, so there's a couple of areas that we focused on. I think when we started, we were interested in genetic factors, but more recently, we've been really interested in things that happen to us as individuals as we get older. So, for an example, people who are overweight or obese, and those that also have what's called metabolic syndrome, which is kind of a combination of diabetes, obesity, and higher cholesterol. And what we've observed, at least um, in some animal modeling that we've done, and also some initial human studies that we're engaged in, is that those individuals seem to be much more susceptible to air pollution. And they do that in part because the normal defenses in their lung are actually altered. Um, and that alteration leads them less able to sort of respond to the normal things that we breathe in that are irritants, and the impacts of that. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, what that might lead to is really thinking about, is this a group that's particularly vulnerable? And then are there specific therapies for those individuals that might impact the course of that, and ultimately lead to sort of less inflammation and irritation in the lung, for an example, in those populations. And so that's kind of where our research has been driving, where it's really trying to look at the interface between doing sort of basic discovery science that leads us to think that these are possibilities, And then how do we take that sort of to the next level of interactions with humans and individuals, and ultimately of forming people who can think about policy measures and or strategies that might really take this forward to really sort of limit those effects.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, our audience has started to warm up a little bit. Let's give you a question from them. Let's see. What plans exist to communicate broadly the impacts you discussed, the need to prioritize climate solutions, and educate the citizenry that this is real and important?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one we've spent a lot of time thinking about in terms of how to go about this. I think it's probably got to be more than one direction. I think there is still a really important piece of using the voice of the university and people who go out to talk broadly about concerns relating to climate and health. But I think the more impactful thing at the end of the day is really trying to highlight the sort of personal relationship that this has to an individual's health and the health of the communities, and really trying to focus on the strategies that really have long-term engagements with communities at risk, to really focus on their needs and what they're appreciating, and how do we address that. And I'll give an example of one that was done by a colleague of mine in the Amazon. So they recognized that snake bites were becoming a more prominent thing that they were seeing in parts of the Amazon where the rivers are really the only transportation spots. And what happens is that the drying season has increased, so those rivers dry up. So then all of a sudden, these communities don't have any access to getting antivenom that would prevent them from having severe effects from snake bites. So what they recognized with engagement within that community was to say, like, okay, well, now we need to go back and maybe actually have the antivenom in the individual communities and figure out a plan for how they would be able to administer that, because they can't travel the way they used to. And so I think those taking those stories and starting to talk more about the stories of where we've been able to impact, and then putting it into something real is really important. I think the other piece that I'm struck with is I met with a bunch of community church leaders, and one of the comments when I met with them was saying, like, as I think probably the person who asked the question is that addressing, is that this is not really on our radar. And I asked what is the thing that's most concerning, and the conversation was around gun violence. And though gun violence has many things that occur, we do know that gun violence is worse in extreme heat. And so, how do we sort of make those tie in those things together? And I think that's got to be part of the communication strategy.
Very insightful. Thank you. Let's see. I do have another question here. If the Trump administration shuts down federal climate data sources, how will this affect climate health research? And are there non US substitutes?
There are non-US substitutes. So obviously I mean, it would be impactful, and it will be impactful, and it is impactful. I think if I'm not a head in the sand kind of person, so this is impactful, and it's going to set back efforts. Um, there are other sources of data across the globe. So the Europeans have fairly good monitoring as well, and individual countries have taken this on. It's actually interesting when you travel to other parts of the globe, and they're very focused on things like air pollution because they know that it impacts their communities, and so they're very interested in sampling and air quality and measuring. So I work with a group in Mongolia who's very, 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 the government is very concerned about their air quality and the impacts of health. So I think there will be an opportunity if US efforts reduce of the rest of the globe for taking up activities and engagement along those lines, but it will be impactful.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to another question here. Where do the policy changers and most vulnerable to risk find how to make a living in community partnerships and health engagements?
repeat that once more. There was a lot there. So I want to make
Absolutely. Where the policy changers and most vulnerable to risk find how to make a living in community partnerships and health engagement.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I think this is an area. There are community organizations that exist in the state of North Carolina and are true in other states across the country that are certainly engaged in climate related activities. I think in terms of providing that information, that's a good question and one we could probably look at in terms of providing more information about groups. In terms of making a living off of that, I do think that there are opportunities with um, community groups to be a part of that. I do think that there will be strain in the next in the near term in terms of those activities. But I do think that this is something that's not going to go away, and there's a real need to make sure that we're engaging appropriately. I think where Duke can be a part of that is by trying to develop our partnerships with communities that we can help hopefully invigorate and support as well. So I don't know if I
Great.
answered the question, but I tried.
I think you did your best. I think that's a complex one, right? All right, two more questions here. Any thoughts on the most effective ways to improve air quality within our homes and how important those might be as we age and spend more time inside our houses?
Yeah, so uh most of the data suggests that HEPA filters are good, so but be careful. The ones that actually have um a UV bulb, so the UV bulb is actually in the home will actually generate ozone. So I would just get the standard HEPA filter. Um, I think if not that case, be mindful of making sure. So one of the things that probably helps indoor air quality is airflow within the home. So most people with central heat and air you do get a certain amount of airflow, but people who have like more window units that they use for heating and cooling probably get less airflow. So in those settings, I might think of HEPA filtration. Uh, there is a lot of interest in the indoor air quality, and that's actually an area of active research of trying to figure out what are the components of that to really be the most impactful. So I think some of this is to be determined, but I think if you were looking for an answer today, I would say if you're concerned, then I would think about purchasing an air filter or a HEPA filter. Again, without the UV bulb. So they tend to sell them together, but you can get them separate.
Great, great advice. Thanks so much. So we have one of our participants trying to determine where you plug into the Duke efforts across the school for climate. So does your work integrate directly with other Duke climate efforts or all of these from different schools running independently? So maybe
No, so
like
it's actually yeah, we all talk to each other. So there are I would think that the efforts is more sort of trying to focus the expertise, but I meet regularly with people from the Office of Climate and Sustainability, which was started for the climate commitment. And we have like monthly meetings to talk about how we organize together. I mean, I think if you're interested in being engaged and a part of this, certainly reaching out is a great way to do that. I know that there's also, again, as part of the campaign, that there's also an effort to try to engage people that are interested in financially supporting some of these efforts, but we have very regular communications to stay together. And that is part of what I see the mission of what I'm doing, particularly related to climate and health, is to try to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. And even though we have different expertise, that we're not duplicating or overdoing efforts. And so I'm not sure exactly how this works, but I'm also happy to talk to anybody offline that's interested and engaged and wants to figure out how to help.
wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Ty. Here's an interesting question. Have you considered a set of specific documentary films to highlight these issues and possible solutions?
You're right on my path. That's kind of one of my active things of working on. I think if some of you so like there I'm not I think this is still widely available. There's a video that's a part of the campaign that actually talks about Toddy Steelman and her engagement with a community that is really the river is central to that community and talks about it. I love that. I think that that's a great venue, and certainly what we've been talking about is how to do some of those things that really demonstrate some of the impact that we can have, because I think there is tremendous potential for impact.
Wonderful. Thank you. Last question before we let you go. Someone is asking about air pollution and how much of that might be due to fossil fuels based on transportation and how much impact EVs could make to that.
Yeah, it's a good question. The There's some nuance in the air pollution world. So the source of air pollutants actually matters, and that some different sources are more toxic than others. Car combustion is a part of that. Um, I think there is a role for EVs in certainly reducing pollution. I don't think it's the only solution there. And understanding that I think as we talk about EVs, as in one of the benefits of being an academic is I try to challenge everything, including sort of the things that I think are we should do and making sure that the data actually supports that. But I do think we have to think about whether the consequences of all the EV production and particularly the mining and and how that can impact other communities. So I think it's a part of it. I think we could also think about ways to be much more efficient with our combustion, right? So, and are there ways to use EVs as a part of that? But also, how do we improve standards for how far we can go with our gas-powered vehicles, et cetera? So I think it's both.
Wonderful. I see some time here, Dr. Tighe. You mentioned something to me before we started the session, which I thought might be nice to present right now. You mentioned a question that you wanted to pose across the audience around their community concerns. Is
Yeah.
that
So
something you want to see what people want to chime into the chat about?
I'd love to actually, if I can use you as a you all as a crowdsource. One of the things that I want to hear more about and I want to know more about is what are you all seeing as things that happen in your community that you think relate to climate change, particularly related to health? And what are the areas that you're concerned about? What would you love to see us work on? I mean, you all are activated enough to be here and to be engaged in this process. It would be really important for me to know what are the things that you'd like to see us focus on, and how can we bring the resources to bear against the problems that you're seeing in your communities, or maybe you don't. That would also be it.
Oh, great. I think we've got some brave folks. Microplastics and their impact on human health,
Yeah,
wildfire impacts on air quality, especially distant fires, building standards related to insulation and heat pumps, selfish voice, their pollution upon cleaning up after themselves and not getting paid for it, preservation of green spaces, effects of climate on allergens or pollen, impacts of overdevelopment in commercial and residential properties, and impact on air quality, efforts by governments to reduce the likelihood of forest fires, keep expanding into
thank you,
poor neighborhoods.
thank you all. This is really helpful.
Yeah, we will definitely capitalize and record all these for Dr. Ty to take a peek at.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all amazing thoughts and amazing things that are important. And I think it highlights a lot of the issues that we've been trying to think about. How do we address? I'll raise the one with chemicals in our environment, things like microplastics. It is an important concern because there's some concern that the not only the materials themselves, but also how they get into our body could be expanded in the setting of heat and more extreme heat.
Great. Well, we definitely have a lot of chat messages to pass your way for you to noodle over, Dr. Ty.
Thank
Is
you
there
for the
anything?
crowdsourcing.
Yeah. You guys are amazing. Thanks for offering us your suggestions. We really like to hear what's going on and your, immediate concerns for yourself and your community. Is there anything you want to close us out with before I say goodbye and thank you?
Yeah, and just that this is a group effort. This is not just me. As one person told me at one point is that the effects of climate on health are the mother of all multidisciplinary problems, and the solutions really require everybody. And even beyond that, it can't just remain in academia. It really needs to make sure that it reaches out to those of you all that are on the call and really feel passionate and strong about that. And so we need all of we need all of your help to really move this work forward. But thank you so much for the time to talk about this important issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ty, for a great session and to our audience for joining us today.